children are incredibly capable of understanding really hard and complex experiences. And when we're not honest with them, they can start to create their own version of what happened, which is oftentimes much more scary than the reality of it. When something happens that disrupts that developmental stage from happening, like a death, like something traumatic happening, and children are provided with the developmentally appropriate information to process it and make sense of it, they can start to develop beliefs: I'm bad things happen with me, the world isn't a safe place. And so if that is your core belief when you're 5, you develop your identity around that belief.
Put your hand on your heart, look up at the sky, smile and say, hey, I'm alive. Thanks for being alive with me today. Welcome to Be Alive with Kate Manser. Today, I am honored to bring you the one and only Dr. Korie Leigh. Dr. Korie Leigh has decades of clinical experience as a certified child life specialist and a thanatologist, an internationally recognized expert in childhood bereavement, trauma-informed care, and compassionate communication. And today we are going to talk about all that and more, including your new book, which is coming out soon, called When Everything Changes, which is written for parents who are looking to have conversations with their kids about death and grief. Welcome to Be Alive, Dr. Korie Leigh.
Thank you so much for having me. I'm really glad that we met at the Endwell event and connected and are here having this conversation.
You were absolutely one of the most delightful people that I met at that conference, which I guess that was in November, so just a few months ago. So besides your incredible work as an author, a professor, and a speaker, you also made me some tea. You also, is this like your just passion project, side hustle?
It is. So the short version is I've been blending tea since maybe I was 10 years old. And I just absolutely love the way that certain herbs work together, not just for a taste, experience, but also as I, looked more deeply into all of the different compounds, how they help regulate our nervous systems. And so in the work that I do with people that are grieving here in Santa Fe, New Mexico, I'm still fairly new. And I started vending at these different craft events. And I got the idea that I should have something else to offer, something else that families can use in their home that isn't just my books or just working with me clinically. And so I spent several months crafting these 3 different herbal blends of teas that are really just so soothing on the nervous system. And personally, I think taste really lovely.
Wow, that's incredible. What a beautiful gift. And thank you for the gift of tea that you gave me. I've been enjoying it. And yeah, what is your favorite blend of tea that you're like really into right now?
Yeah, so I definitely oscillate, but at the moment it's called Mend Leaf, and it is a different that has calendula, it has red rooibos, and a little bit of peppermint. So it kind of like hits all the flavor notes, but it's also, like I said, just so soothing. You inhale it and you can smell the vanilla from the rooibos, and then when you taste it, it just makes you feel so calm.
Oh, that's so beautiful. I'm just imagining you as a 10-year-old beginning your tea journey. P.S. What 10-year-old? You're like, I've been blending tea since I was 10. I'm like, okay, we're gonna come back to that one, Korie,
Yeah.
because we'll get into your background in a little bit. But just starting off, I want to just help me understand and help everyone listening understand. Your new book is about how parents. It's about tips and practical advice about how parents can talk to their kids about death and grief. So help us understand that when a parent or someone dies or a pet, or rather when a family member dies or a pet, what is the hard truth about hiding or sanitizing that death from kids?
And it's really, really hard, right? Because parents and people in general want to protect children and they want to not scare them and they want to make sure that they're going to be okay. And oftentimes in our culture, what we do is when we're uncomfortable with something or there's a topic that we're really unfamiliar with, we distance ourselves from it. And so we try to do the same thing with kids and shield them and protect them. But the downside to that is that children are incredibly capable of understanding really hard and complex experiences. And when we're not honest with them, they can start to create their own version of what happened, which is oftentimes much more scary than the reality of it. Lots of misconceptions can occur, and particularly in younger children, ages 3 to 7, there's a lot of misconceptions that they somehow caused this thing to happen, that they're to blame, that they're guilty for it. And these are all very normal misconceptions that kids have, but they can be addressed really gently and concretely when given appropriate, developmentally sound information. And in my clinical work, I would get families coming time after time wanting to have these conversations, but not knowing what to say, where to start, and how to answer the questions that kids would have. And so that's why I wrote this book. And it isn't just for death loss, it's divorce, incarceration, community events that are impacted by tornadoes or floods, mass casualty events. Like, how do we talk to kids about loss experiences in a way that doesn't scare them, that's honest, and that also helps us as the parents or the adults in their life to develop the resilience, right? To continue to have these conversations day after day.
Ooh, wow. So the kids have this, like you said, this just very normal tendency. If they aren't given any information about what's going on, they perceive it anyway, and then they begin to form their own stories. And one of those stories being, I did something bad, this is my fault. And so the harm then in not addressing it is it's sort of this runaway train of insert false story here of what the child might invent. And kids are very creative, right? So they're going to invent a lot of crazy stories, right?
Oh, absolutely. And so what happens too is when these events happen when children are very young, in general, when we're young, that's when we form what we call our core belief, our core sense of self. And a core sense of self is usually something really simple, like I'm a good person or the world is a safe place. Good things happen when I'm around. Those can be some kind of basic core beliefs. When something happens that disrupts that developmental stage from happening, like a death, like something traumatic happening, and children are provided with the developmentally appropriate information to process it and make sense of it, they can start to develop beliefs. I'm bad things happen with me, the world isn't a safe place. And so if that is your core belief when you're 5, you develop your identity around that belief, right? And so it's important for the adults in a child's life to be able to model appropriate conversations, talking about hard things, and helping to like dispel some of those myths and misconceptions. And I can give an example of just like a really basic misconception that kids have. So when I was working in adult hospice, there was, I believe she was in her 80s, an 80-year-old grandmother who was at the end of life. And I had just started working with the family, hadn't met the kids, hadn't really had many conversations. And I got a phone call that the grandma had died and that the kids were quote unquote a wreck. And so I packed my bag and I drove over to the house. And by the time I got there, there was an infant. She was around 1. And then there was an 8-year-old boy. And the 8-year-old boy was in the backyard having a panic attack, hyperventilating, like completely inconsolable. And so eventually, after using some techniques that I teach in my book, I was able to regulate his nervous system, help him calm down. And I asked him to help me understand what had happened. And what had happened was when grandma died, his parents, because they wanted to protect him, because they didn't know what to say, had said, the angels have come to take grandma. And so when we think about it, just language wise, that isn't scary, right? On the surface, the angels came to take grandma. But in the developmental mind of an 8-year-old who's in between 2 cognitive stages, he interpreted that as somebody came to take grandma. So when are they going to take me? And are they going to take mommy and daddy? And are they going to take us away from our home? And that's what he heard in those words, the angels came to take grandma.
Oh my gosh. It would have never crossed my mind to think about it from that perspective. And it's, I mean, I'm not trying to make light of it because what a beautiful thing that you were able to interpret that for him and soothe him in that moment and see that, and that now you've translated it into this book. But essentially, he got like the angels kidnapped grandmother.
Yeah.
Right? Like the angels kidnapped her and they're going to kidnap everybody. And we would never, because we have the other layer of understanding of what the shrouded meaning of the angels took. We know it, but they don't. And so it's like, if the angels are like masked men for all he knows. And wow, so that's really incredible. So you've touched a little bit on how that impacts us as adults. You said something about how it affects our sense of self. We begin to think, internalize maybe that things are our fault. I
Hmm.
remember when I was around 12 and a family member ha- uh, ended their lives. And it was someone that I didn't know super well, but I had met, and we had all just been on this camping trip like a month or two before. And my mom didn't allow me to go to the funeral. And it's still such a salient memory from my childhood. I was so just upset and hurt. And I felt just so cut off that my mom didn't allow me to go to the funeral because I was feeling emotions. This was a person that I knew, I remembered. So when we sanitize and hide mortality from children, like in the experience that I had, and so many of us do, how does that? Can you go into more detail about how that impacts us as adults?
Absolutely. And there have been some recent studies that have looked at the instances of things like anxiety, depression, and other kind of mental health challenges in adulthood from children who experienced losses as a child. So there can be an increase in anxiety and depression. There can be an increase in substance use disorders amongst people who've had an unprocessed grief. Right. And so, what we mean by that is grief that was unacknowledged, grief that was not attended to, grief that was not validated or given a place to be felt and processed. And so, what I'm talking about is also this concept called disenfranchised grief, which is essentially when society or a culture doesn't make space for your grief. It makes space for certain kinds of grief experiences. And there are 5 different aspects that can fall into disenfranchised grief. And the griever themselves can be one of them, meaning that a whole group of people can be disenfranchised from, you don't have the permission to grieve. And children fall into that because we oftentimes think that, well, they're young, they'll forget it, they're resilient, they'll just get through it. And yeah, they will get through it because that's what we do as humans. We inherently get through really hard stuff. But when it comes to this pivotal developmental time in a child's life and an adolescent's life, these are opportunities to teach them coping skills, to teach them how to talk about hard things. Resilience is a muscle. We're all born with it, but it doesn't mean that it's ready to go from day one. It has to be taught and fostered and developed and modeled. And so when you look at 2 people who went through like a really traumatic or really hard loss as children, and one of them appears to be thriving and doing well, and the other one of them appears to really still be struggling. If you were to go back and kind of do some digging and ask a little bit about, well, after the death happened, were you talked to about what it means to die, what grief is, how we feel it, why we feel it? Fun fact, we grieve as whole people, right? Our bodies grieve. There are fMRI studies that show how different parts of our brain are impacted. Our immune system is impacted. Our vestibular system of our brain, meaning like we are clumsy and we bump into things. Like there's so many things that happen when we're grieving. We're not taught any of this. And oftentimes as children, they will internalize it to think there's something wrong with them, and also to be parentified within a family system. So they won't bring it up because they don't want to upset mom or dad, or they won't bring it up because they want to be seen as the strong one.
Wow. So then how does a parent rectify? I mean, there's a lot going on there. This, understanding that this can be internalized and the child might think it's their fault. How does that get rectified with a parent's desire to protect their child as well as maybe their own discomfort, right? Because it's kind of like this Venn diagram of it's easier just to
Yeah.
not do it, right? But what you're calling us to do in this new paradigm as caregivers, as leaders, as stewards of these children, you're calling us to have these conversations. So how do we rectify those three things to have those hard conversations?
Yeah, we recognize that all of those things can be true and are true at one time. You can absolutely protect and support your child and also have hard conversations. You can be terrified to have that conversation and still have it. Just like we can hold pain and joy, just like grief can live alongside beauty and hope. There's this space that, I call and other people in the field call the in between. It's a bit of a liminal space. It's not quite here and it's not quite there, but it's this gray space of recognizing that these realities exist at once. I can not know exactly what to say, but I'm going to try. I can be shaking on the inside, but my voice can remain calm, right? And do it even though it's hard to do. And that's why I wrote my book, and all of my books really, is to help provide families with the language, the tools, here's how you start. And oftentimes, what families will report is just like with children, right? They've created this story in their heads about how scary this is going to be or how much harder it is. And then they have that first conversation and they're like, oh, that really wasn't as bad as I thought it would be. Another misconception that families have too is that these conversations are going to be really long. They're going to be very complicated and really in depth. When in reality, sometimes kids only need a 2-sentence answer. And then they're filled up, they're done, they're at capacity. But they're going to come back and ask you follow-up questions maybe a day later, maybe before bedtime, right? And so in my book, I talk about this method called the dosing method. Essentially, you give a little bit of information and you see what happens. You answer the question very simply and you see, do they ask follow-up questions? Do they say, like one kid I worked with, oh, that's what dead means. Okay. Can we get ice cream?
That's what dead means. Okay. Definition illuminated. Now let's talk about some ice cream.
Yeah.
Let's talk about the important things here. There is that truth that you're bringing up, this liminal space of multiple things being true. Of course, we can be scared. We can still have the conversation. And I think you're illuminating also here that as adults, when we are uncomfortable, our anxiety tends to build this up in our mind as this big, hairy, scary conversation when really we can dose it out, and that's actually can be healthier for the kids. We don't need to
Yeah.
kind of word vomit or lay everything on them at once. Just give them a little bit, let that sink in, and then they can either come to us with follow-up questions or we can dose it out. As the caretakers, that's our job. We dose things out because, we know more. Wow. So, what does this new paradigm, because I think that's what you're proposing, is this new paradigm of parenting where we have these conversations, where we look at this liminal space, we recognize that they can be uncomfortable and scary, and yet we do it anyways because we see a better future and we know better, so we want to do better for our kids. So what is this new paradigm of parenting with grief and death conversations being on limits conversations instead of off limits? Why is that more important than ever now?
It teaches emotional flexibility and it teaches resilience, right? And resilience is it's a hot topic term, right? Like you've seen it thrown out there a lot. But in my experience, resilience is what I was talking about before. It's that muscle. And when we can learn what it is, where it is, and how to use it, we can get through really hard things in life with more ease. Not saying it's easier. I'm just saying we can get through it with more ease and not get stuck in it. Because in this day and age, the reality is none of us are going to get through this life without really, really hard things happening. And if we're to be radically honest with each other about that, we can get through things with ease, build resilience, become better people, better communities, have more emotionally resonant conversations. And why does this matter, right? Because when we're able to recognize emotions, name what they are, let ourselves feel the emotion, and it moves through us, we can just keep doing this for all eternity. When things get stuck, when anxiety lives inside of us, when fear lives inside of us, when uncertainty lives inside of us and has no place to go, that's when we see community suffer. Because it's not just happening individually, it's happening collectively, right? How do we hold that there are atrocities happening in the world and also that there are really beautiful, incredible things happening in the world too? Like, how do we recognize both of those and not let one of them take precedent while ignoring the other?
Wow, that's incredible. Yeah, you bring up a great point, which is that resilience is more important than ever. Regardless of everything that's happening politically and globally, we're in this information age where we're getting so much information all of the time that resilience is probably, I mean, I would say probably the most important trait that we can instill in our kids today. I've been thinking about how I wonder if I'll ever be able to have a moment of respite in my lifetime. I hope certainly in our kids' lifetimes, but just sort of the way it's looking with everything just sort of being heightened. I'm like, okay, I might be buckled up on this ride of intensity for at least the rest of most of my life. I hope the kids, like I said, get a respite, but that need for resilience. And what you're saying is that if you want to prepare your children for resilience, and to weather the storms of a lot of challenge and intensity that's going on in our present day world, that talking about death and grief around us is one really really effective way of doing that. So one of the things that we might be avoiding is potentially one of the most effective ways to prepare our kids for difficulties in life.
Absolutely. And then when we think about all of the loss experiences that our young people are going through, and death being one of them, but we're now creating a term of climate anxiety, right? Like there is a very specific type of existential and very real threat that our young people and a lot of people are feeling towards the environment and towards the climate change. That's something that we've never seen before, right? And when we think about, depending on where you're listening from, if you're here in America, we have a mass casualty epidemic. We have school shootings. We have so many things that are impacting our communities. And then when we think about, and those are kind of the big things, and then we think about the little losses, the first relationship that will end, moving out of your childhood home, going to college. Those are all, meaningful, fun things, but they're also losses. And when we can validate and acknowledge that loss is present, it is integrated, it is woven into our everyday, we can start to peel back the layers and make these conversations not so scary. We can make them more palatable. And when things are more palatable, we can engage with them.
Ooh. So you're right. We have a lot of death and grief that's prevalent in our everyday, in our society. And I'm curious if you have other ways that we as adults can talk with kids about these other losses, like you said, preparing a kid for some of these smaller losses that we will all encounter in our life, the loss of a relationship. I have one nephew he's a very sentimental boy, and he has like, he doesn't want to give up his toothbrush even when it's time to throw the toothbrush away. So I'm curious, if we're not necessarily addressing directly head on mass casualty incidents, climate, what are other ways that we can incorporate the narrative of endings and loss in our family lives and with kids that is maybe a complement to the heavy, deeper conversations, but maybe some lighter ways that we can bring their attention to endings and loss in a safe and healthy way throughout daily life?
Yeah, and these are what we call teachable moments. And there are teachable moments every day. So I'll give one example. There was a family I was working with who had gone through a lot of loss. But on top of that, they were moving. They were moving out of the home that they'd all known together and in the same city, but still in a different house. And so I worked with them to create a goodbye ritual to the house itself. They all went into every room. They shared a story, their favorite memory of that room, and they went through the whole house. They had the kids draw pictures of the house, thanking the house for the memories and the time. And then together they all buried the letters in the backyard. That's one example. Another example is at Christmas time. I live with two 6-year-olds who are also very sentimental. And at Christmas time, when the tree is ready to be, shipped off and goes away, there are tears. They don't want the tree to go. And so we use that as an opportunity to thank the tree, to have conversations about how everything has a beginning and an end. And this is the end of the tree's time here. And so using transition moments, using that general conversation of a beginning and an end, and trying to find ways to include the kids in these conversations, right? So if you're moving, if there's a friend circle change and you're no longer friends with the ones that you used to be friends with, like how do we take these everyday experiences and find ways to acknowledge that it's a loss, validate whatever feelings are coming up, and then find a place for those feelings. And oftentimes it's through play, it's through reading and books, it's through art making, where we create a place for those feelings to go.
Ooh. And the beauty of that ritual of going from room to room, sharing memories, thanking the room, saying goodbye. Same thing with the tree, sharing the favorite memories from that holiday season, thanking the tree, talking about how its time is to move on. It occurs to me that so many of us feel that we live in this harried pace of life. And it's like we go from this to this to this, that we actually are not honoring these endings. And if we could slow down, just like you're saying, these beautiful, beautiful rituals of just slowing down and honoring these endings instead of just going on to the next thing and like, suck it up, it's over, just forget about it, taking the time to, I feel like, I wonder if it would also, in addition to building resilience, feel as if it's giving a slightly slower, more sacred pace
Mhm.
of life as well.
Absolutely. And, in a lot of work I do, we talk about ritual. And I was actually looking at a recent study on the use of ritual in grief, and there's over 33 definitions of ritual, which I find fascinating. And so the personal definition that I use is a ritual is any act that is repeated, infused with meaning and purpose. So if you take that, okay, so any act that you repeat, well, I tie my shoes every day. If I put intention into that and I give myself a little affirmation, may these shoes carry me to greater places today. That's a ritual. That was 15 seconds, maybe 5, right? They don't have to be long, extensive. They don't require special tools. You don't have to purchase anything. We can take these transitional moments in life and have a pause, reflect that they happened, they are happening, and something new is coming.
Wow. There's a topic in parenting, I believe it's about creating this concept of what's called core memories. And so, I've seen videos of parents who will like, you know, wake their kids up at 8 p.m. and after they had just, gone to bed, even though they weren't really sleeping, and be like, we're going to go get ice cream, to create this really standout moment in their life, to create a core memory that hopefully they will remember throughout life. But it's really more focused on these sort of blip, very unusual moments. But what occurs to me as you're sharing this really beautiful concept of building rituals with kids is those are also like, you can think of your own parents or caregivers, what their isms were, like the things that they repeated over and over throughout our childhood that really stuck with us. And it occurs to me that another way to create core memories is not just about the Disneyland trips or the 8 p.m. ice cream. Those are great, but building these rituals of saying these things that can be very affirmative, and that repetition creates that memory that will then create this memory throughout our lives.
Absolutely. And what we know about brain science is that the memories that we have the strongest recall of childhood are not linked to things, they're linked to emotions, to the strong emotions. And so this is an example of something a little different, but like just bear with me and I'll get to the end. I was working with a 9-year-old whose father was dying from a glioblastoma. I had been working with her for about a year. And then several months after he died, I continued to work with her. And she had requested that I bring puffy paint and a canvas tote because she wanted to make a tote bag. And I thought, simple enough. So I got the puffy paint, got the canvas tote. And what ensued was about a half an hour of her just completely breaking down. The puffy paint it wasn't thin enough. It was getting everywhere. Nothing that she wanted in her mind, how she wanted it to be, was what was coming out on the canvas. And so in my head, I'm like, oh, well, this is not going very well. Um, okay. And so, we get through the whole session. Several months later, I'm coming to an end with my work with her. And we did a brief activity where I had her reflect. Think about all the different things that we did together, different activities we did, different crafts that we made. What was your favorite? And you know what she said? The day that we made the puffy paint tote. I was completely blown away. In my mind, I was like, that was a terrible session. It didn't go anywhere how I wanted it to go. I don't think she got anything out of it. But in her mind, she connected being able to choose the paint, create the thing that she wanted to, even though it didn't really end up as what she thought it was going to be in her mind. And because she was able to cry and express her feelings, that to her was a positive memory. And so for all the parents out there that are like, I don't have the money to do these grand things, or I don't have the time to do these grand things, it's not about grand acts. It's about emotion. It's about deep intention, meaningful experiences that elicit emotion. And it doesn't always have to be a positive emotion.
Ooh, I got the chills when you said that those core memories are not about things, they're about emotions. And we tend to think that it is the happy emotions, right? The ice cream at 8 p.m., the Disneyland surprise trip that I mentioned, but even those moments of catharsis and being met. And you've showed up for her with the puffy paint and the totes as per requested, right? Like you were there for her. And then she felt safe enough to have this cathartic moment of emotion. And that was her highlight. What we would consider, or what you even considered then to be a failure. Wow, this is just really opening my mind about what is meaningful for kids. And we tend to want to have this very, I think, like Disneyland cartoon, sunshine and roses. We want to create that for the children around us. And that's fine. Of course, we want to do that. But to also be able to hold space for those big emotions and to create a space safe enough where, in a world with so many people who have difficulty having big conversations, to be that home for kids to say, hey, I can talk about anything with this adult. I can cry in front of this adult. I can ask them about death. I can ask them about sex. I can tell them when I'm sad that the Christmas tree is going away. I don't feel like I have to bottle it up and never, and keep it in the annals of my mind until I'm 60 years old and the memory comes back. But what a beautiful mind opening and like you said, research backed perspective to share. Thank you so much for sharing that story.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that and I have, dozens of stories like this. And that is why I wrote the book, is to take all of this information and try and package it in a way that a busy parent could read it. So it is chock full of information, but it is also meant that, like, read the first part up front. You don't ever have to read it again. And then flip to the chapter which your family is going through. Look at the script, look at the questions kids tend to ask, and look at the answers that I've given. Look at what do I do about the fact that I'm anxious about it, right? And so there's tips and tricks for how parents can manage their anxiety and kind of do a check-in with themselves of where they're at. Is this really the best time to have the conversation? And so I just had all this information in my head. It's like, oh, I've got to get this out into like some kind of compact guide.
Ooh, beautiful. Well, thank you so much for your work. Let's turn to learn a little bit more about you. You've shared such a wealth of information already, and I'm curious about you. So let's start by just help me understand, how do you define what you do?
That's such a good question. And every time somebody asks me, what do I do? Or what's my job? I always pause and I probably look like a deer in a headlights. I'm like, how much time do you have? Because I do so much. I mean, at its core, what I do is I help people, families, children, communities navigate stressful life experiences centered around loss. And I do that in a variety of ways. I have my academic hat, where I'm the director of a graduate program in thanatology. And so I'm educating the next generation of clinicians and physicians and hospice chaplains and social workers to be more grief informed. So I have that academic research hat. I have my clinical hat, where I do work specifically with medically fragile children and their families. And then I have my grief practice, where I'm doing a lot of grief work. I have my advocacy. I actually just spoke at the New Mexico State Capitol to help expand access of pediatric palliative care to children here in New Mexico. So I do a lot of advocacy. I speak, I give workshops, presentations, keynote addresses, and then I write books. And everything at its core boils down to helping to create more grief informed communities, increase what we call grief literacy. So having these explicit conversations about death, dying, grief, and loss, making it not so scary, and providing tools, like concrete tools, to kids and families and communities, so that when things are really hard, they have a little toolkit that they can go to get through it.
And what's all under that? What's in your heart? What drives you inside to do this incredible work?
So I was reflecting on this the other day as I've been asked to give a keynote address in Italy, and they want me to talk about my life and my life story. And I haven't really ever sat down and kind of pieced these things together, but I'll give you a little snippet of, and this is why I can't answer it directly. When I was born, my mother was really sick and she almost died. And so this was back in the early 80s. Practices of healthcare settings are very different now. But back in the 80s, when my mom had just given birth to me and she was fighting for her life in the intensive care unit, I was a healthy baby. They just kind of passed me around to the nurses at the nurses station for the first several weeks of my life. I just lived in the hospital. And at one point, and again, this is hearsay, this is what my mother and other people in my family have told me, that at some point, because my mom was in the ICU, they would bring me up there and they would put me on her chest. And they noticed that her heart rate would decrease and she'd become less agitated. Then they started doing that with other people. So they would put me as a baby on other patients' chests and notice that their heart rate would come down and they would become more relaxed. And so I share that story as I feel like I was born to do this work. And I don't say that lightly. That was my entrance into the world. And from there, like my great grandma, she raised me essentially when I was a very little kid. And we would take daily walks to the cemetery and have a picnic in the cemetery as like a 3-year-old, 4-year-old. So I would be in the cemetery having picnics with my great grandma, talking to the headstones, asking her questions about who everybody was. And I just have story after story of this at each different phase of my life, like becoming closer to death, becoming closer to the underworld. I was reading tarot at 12. Like, so, Carolyn Myss, like I read her book when I was around that age as well. So I think I was always just really tapped into and tuned into supporting people who were suffering and supporting people who were at the end of life. And my career path wasn't like, I didn't set out to do that. I set out to be a music therapist, and I wanted to weave my love of music and being a musician with helping people. But very quickly, once I started college, I found out about child life, which is the field of child life. And then that kind of just opened all of the doors of my career in terms of working in a hospital setting with very critically ill kids.
Thank you for sharing that story. I was so right there with you as you're talking about your first few weeks of life in the hospital, being passed around to the nurses, being passed around to, it sounds like some of the patients, and bringing peace and calm wherever you were just from that very early age. And then, yeah, picnics in the cemetery at 3. That was not what I was doing at 3, and then now we do come full circle now to the tea blending at 10. And it's funny because you do have this very transpersonal, witchy, spiritual side, but you are also a scientist. Where did the science part come in this career path for you?
Yeah, and I'll also share too that I almost didn't graduate high school. I really, really struggled with academics. I found out later that I had dyslexia, dyscalculia. I'm what we call like neurospicy. But back in the 80s, like it's just you're not trying hard enough. So, I really, really struggled and didn't ever imagine that I would be a writer, let alone have a PhD, let alone be interested in science and research. And it was really my clinical work. Um, I talk about in my book this concept of stress and coping theory, which essentially boils down to when there's a stressor, we respond to that stressor by either moving towards it as an information based coper because we want to understand it, or we move away from it and we are an emotion focused coper. And so we're trying to manage the emotions that the stressful thing is causing us. So I happen to be an information based coper, which inherently means when something stresses me out, or if I don't understand something, I have to move towards it and understand it better. And so it was really like the first week that I started working as a child life specialist, I was inundated with so many deaths and I wasn't prepared for it. And I didn't understand my emotional reaction to it. And I didn't feel prepared to support these families that I was working with in the way that I wanted to. And so when I went back and I got my first master's in public health and thanatology, that's when I started to really get very interested in, oh, this isn't just a practice. There is a science to this. And now we have fMRI studies, we have like biological markers of grief. Like there's so much evidence, but it also wasn't until I had learned how to learn, right? Like having learning challenges throughout my childhood, I didn't know there was a name for what I had. And I certainly didn't know that there were tools that I could use. So even though I have dyscalculia, I can now do math. I couldn't really do math in high school. And that's the reason
What
I've
is
written
dyscalculia? Just
so
so
dyscal,
I
yeah.
don't, I'm
So
not familiar with that word.
yeah, dyscalculia is the second most diagnosed learning challenge among children and adolescents. And it is essentially challenges with computations. And so the concept of math being a language. And, I describe it to people that if you were to put like a simple math problem in front of me, it would literally look like gibberish. I would not understand the concept of division. So like understanding the concepts were really challenging. I would also invert numbers. So like sixes and nines would get inverted, but also with dyscalculia, which is something a lot of people don't know about, is there are spatial challenges. So your left from your right, showing up for things on time, understanding this connects to that. So there's a lot of ways that the brain itself is just looking at math and numbers and distance and time differently. And once I learned that, I was actually in my doctoral program and I was going through assessments. So administering like intelligent testing to diagnose these things. That's when I learned, oh my goodness, like there are strategies. When I see a whole group of numbers, I know now I can group them by twos and then I can remember them.
Wow. Wow, and you did not find this out until you were in your doctorate program.
Well, I was diagnosed with dyscalculia when I was 16, but that was just the diagnosis. I didn't, there was nothing other than that. Like, oh,
Yeah.
you have a diagnosis, so you can get more time on tests. Cool.
Like, great, I still can't understand it.
How do I take the test? So yeah, no, it really wasn't until I was in my 30s that I really started to understand, okay, here's how a typical brain sees numbers, sees computations, understands complex patterns. Here's how my brain understands it, and here's how I can connect those two things. And so that's why I wrote my fourth book, which is coming out in September, which is called Why Are the Numbers All Jumbled? And it's a kid's book of dyscalculia.
Wow. Ugh, you are such a star. That is so rad. And you brought up also this concept that I had not heard before of whether an individual is it typically binary more or less? I mean, of the information based processor and the emotional based processor, because I definitely am an information based processor. Like
Yeah.
I'm an insane medical researcher. I mean, I have to like know everything, and then that brings me calm when I can like
Mhm.
understand it logically. How so I get information-based processor, and that's what you and I have. Can you go into a little bit more detail about how an emotional-based processor copes?
Yeah, absolutely. So, an emotion based processor, like, for example, when I was preparing kids for medical procedures, part of that preparation is education, helping the kids know what's going to happen, how long is going to happen, why is it happening in developmentally appropriate terms. Understanding if someone is an emotion focused coper is really important because the information I provide is going to be little itty bitty, just enough for them to understand what's going to happen. We don't go into details. So when you're an emotion focused coper, you're essentially doing things that focus on your emotion. So let's say the stressor is causing you anxiety. You don't want to talk about the stressor. You don't want to go to a support group or go to therapy or call your friend up and talk about it. Maybe you are going to take a bath. Maybe you're going to do some kind of soothing activities, maybe yoga, maybe going for a run. Maybe you're going to distract and watch whatever reality TV show you're watching to distract from the primary stressor that is causing you the distress.
So self-soothing, that is so important. Yeah.
Yeah.
And I can definitely say as an information-based processor, I still also need self-soothing. So I can see how
Yes.
both of actually need both of them. And I excel in the information-based processing, but the self-soothing is where I could stand to be
Exactly.
a
And
little
so
kinder to myself.
in a crisis, like we are going to gravitate towards one or the other. When there's a really big stressor, my job isn't to be like, oh, you're information focused. I'm going to teach you some emotion focused. Absolutely not. We move towards what is working, right? And if information is working, let's start there. And once the nervous system starts to relax a little bit, that's when we can teach new strategies. And so it's important to recognize we are both, but we will gravitate towards one or the other. And trying to like teach a skill in the middle of a crisis is probably the wrong time.
Yeah, yeah, and this is so helpful not only for understanding ourselves, but also understanding the kids around us again, and
Yes.
whether they appear to be information based or emotional based processor. And then what you're saying is learning how to meet them where they are in the moment, which is go with what works for them. And then
Yes.
how can we nurture them once the nervous system is regulated? If they need a little bit of the other, if the information based processor needs some emotional stuff, or if the emotional one needs a little bit more information, but you're saying after the nervous system is regulated, after the active threat has passed. Um,
Yes.
so you shared a really beautiful moment about that puffy paint, but I want to just go a little bit deeper. And if you can just think back, maybe in the early phases of your career, I would love it if you could just share a moment in your career that really has stuck out with you, and that when you are having a hard time and where you're struggling, that you think about that thing that happened and it just drives you.
I have so many of them. Very early in my career, this was the first position that I had. I was working at a really big children's hospital on the medical surgical ICU. These are like the sickest of sick kids. I was freshly 22 years old, out of my bachelor's, with like the right blend of naivete and like passion. I look back and I'm like, I could have only done that work in my 20s. I joke when I watch the show The Pit, like you couldn't pay me enough to go back to the hospital. It was such high stakes and so stressful all the time. But I remember in that first week there was a family that I had just started working with, and their baby had a life threatening condition. They were doing everything that they could to save the baby, but it was looking likely that their life would be very limited. We're talking maybe months.
Mm.
And at the time, the family, I believe the baby was like 3 months old. And so when I met them, there was this little itty bitty baby, new parents. They had all this hope for what this baby's life was going to look like, what their life was going to look like. And the medical team is telling them none of what you thought was going to happen is going to happen. And so they were understandably devastated. And when I walked in and started introducing myself and what child life could offer and the role that I had, they weren't really sure what to do with me. But I just kept coming back. I was consistent. I would show up every day. I would build a relationship. And then over the next several weeks, we started talking about what their hopes were, how their hopes had changed and shifted. And that even though their child was dying, they still had hopes. And one of the hopes that they had come to determine was they wanted to celebrate. They wanted to celebrate that their child was here now and mattered. And so I offered gently, I was like, well, what if we celebrated every milestone, right? Like this baby was going to turn 4 months old in a few weeks. Let's have a 4-month-old birthday. And they were totally into it. And we got streamers and balloons and a little cake. And we had the staff write their their favorite memory of that child on this big bulletin board. And over time, so after this event happened, over time the family went home. They brought their baby home on hospice. I never saw them again. Like I worked with them for maybe a month. They went home to their lives. But I remember them every day. And I remember the trepidation that I had as a fresh, brand new clinician. Am I saying the right thing? Am I doing the right thing? Is this the right thing? Is that the right thing? What if? What if? And reflecting on that and realizing that everything was exactly how it needed to be. That family needed me there in that time to help them be able to celebrate that baby's 4th month of life and then eventually 5th and 6th month, and celebrate the small moments, finding the hope, finding the miracles, right? And miracle isn't always a cure. And so that's what I stay with, that every moment matters, finding the hope, finding the meaning. We have to make it, right? It's not just there.
Finding the hope, finding the meaning, even when the hope for the full life that we had doesn't exist anymore. And it sounds like you come back to that moment of finding a hope at all odds, at all odds. And some of the work that you do is so beautiful and so challenging. I mean, you're working with children who are sick. You're working with children who have lost parents, parents that have lost children. I mean, on and on, and what you come to is celebrating every moment that we have and celebrating a 4-month birthday just because we can. And honestly, because that's what we have to do. It sounds like that's what we have to do is just celebrate what we have because we don't know what is to come.
Absolutely. And we understand now. And this is, one of the things that I've come to love about the intersection of what I do, how there's the clinician and then the academic, right? There's no science that supports that. There's research that helps us understand the role of meaning, the role of hope, what resiliency is, like all of these things that I just inherently was doing because I thought it was the right thing. We now have evidence that supports and backs not just that it is, but how and the mechanism behind it. And I find that so beautiful that, our gut feeling, the intuition that we have, follow that. It is right.
So as we come to the end of our time today, I'm so in awe of you and your level of knowledge and the level of witchiness and spirituality and just this amazing blend that you bring and intuition to your work. What is your vision for the future in your career or in the greater world?
I sincerely hope and work towards people being able to hold the both, being able to show up for their community when tragedy and crisis happens, and also being able to take breaks and laugh and find joyful moments as those things are happening concurrently. That is my sincere hope for the world, because hard stuff is going to continue to happen. We're not going to stop it. That is a part of being human, is to recognize and sit with suffering, but not let it take you down, not let you sink with it. Right. And so that's my sincere hope. I'm like a global level. And personally, career wise, I'm really stepping into more speaking and keynotes, presentations, workshops, trainings, like helping communities and organizations create more grief informed places, teaching people how to have these hard conversations.
So you're out here to connect with people, to share this message, and to help build the resilience that we all need, parents, children, and all of us alike. And your new book is called When Everything Changes, and it is out March 31st, 2026.
Yes.
Is that right? Wonderful.
Yes.
And where else can people find and connect with you if they're interested in learning more about your keynotes or your workshops or any online programs that you have?
So you can go to my website, which is KorieLeighPhD.com. I am also on social media. I'm on Instagram and TikTok and LinkedIn. And then my books are published with Free Spirit Publications. And I'll just let everyone know that if you work for a nonprofit, if you work for a school district, you can get a discount for bulk purchases directly through the publisher. I'm actually just working with a school district that ordered bulk of all three of my books, and they just went through the publisher and it's going to get shipped right to their school district. So definitely reach out if you have questions about that.
Thank you so much. And thank you for joining today and sharing your wisdom and dropping so much knowledge and inspiring all of us to have the hard and, as you said, both the hard and beautiful conversations that life is made of.
Thank you so much for having me.
Thank you for listening to this episode of Be Alive with Kate Manser. And thank you for listening to any episode of Be Alive with Kate Manser that you have ever listened to. It seriously means so much to me. You guys, we are coming up on 1 year of this show. What? Yes, and I am not going anywhere. In fact, I am doubling down. I have the most epic and beautiful, exciting season 2, year 2 planned for you. We are going to go even more deeply into the science, philosophy, psychology, and woo-woo of the wild and wonderful experience of being alive, as well as one of my personal favorites, as you know, mortality awareness, mystical experience, and beyond. It's going to be so, so good. Thanks for being here. Share this with a friend, subscribe, and let's let this little show shine its light wherever it's meant to, but with the help of your sharing. Thank you so much. All my love. Thanks for being alive with me today.